Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be continuing our Old Testament survey, now looking at the world of the Old Testament. If we were to start all the way over to the west, notice we've got the Atlantic. We have this desert that runs all the way to India, and yet it's broken up by two river systems within our square. We're going to zoom in on that right now. On the one hand, there is the Nile River basin, and to the east we have the Euphrates and Tigris. Notice how they sort of slope in. And connecting those two major river systems are a few minor ones. And somebody noticed quite some time ago that if you use your imagination a little bit, you can perhaps imagine a crescent-shaped area. And so this area of relative fertility has become known as the Fertile Crescent. And it's comprised of these two major river systems, the Nile and then the Euphrates and the Tigris River, and then some minor rivers, including the river Orontes and also the Jordan River, the little tiny river system that is so well known to us in light of Israel's history. Now, we have these two major centers of civilization that grew up around these two major rivers. Egypt was always sort of its own. We're going to call it Egypt. They didn't use that term for themselves early on. That is actually some Greeks got there, and they were wandering around as sightseers, and they asked, what is this? What do you call this place? And they happened to be in this little town called Egyptus, and so the people said, well, this is Egyptus. And so they referred to it as Egypt, and then the name stuck for us. They don't call it Egypt today. They've never called it Egypt except as they learned how to speak English, and they know that's our term for it. But we're going to continue to use that name. Over to the east, we have the Tigris and Euphrates river systems, and that land there has come to be known, at least in English, as Mesopotamia. That comes from a Greek word meaning land between the rivers. And that name is appropriate because there's these two river systems, the Euphrates and the Tigris River, and even from ancient times they called it, they didn't use the term Mesopotamia, but they used a similar term that meant the same thing, the land between the rivers. So it's a good title for that country. Notice I'm not using today's modern geographic boundaries. Those are sort of arbitrary, and so I won't be calling Mesopotamia Iraq, even though it is in the modern day country of Iraq. Egypt is still sort of Egypt, but their ancient boundaries were a bit different. Really, ancient Egypt was the land right alongside the Nile. If you left the Nile area, you're really sort of leaving Egypt. Some other places that we ought to mention along the way, it won't come up a lot in our Bible study, but I had to make mention of it here. There was a land to the northwest of Mesopotamia known as Hatti. We refer to them as the Hittites. They are mentioned a couple of times in the Bible, but not overwhelmingly so. There is, though, this area between Mesopotamia and Egypt, what we could call part of that Fertile Crescent, but I'm going to describe it as a land bridge. That is, if you were in Mesopotamia and you wanted to get to Egypt, if you wanted to go from one major center of civilization to the other major center of civilization, you had to go across this land bridge. You had to go through Israel, or Canaan, as it was more early called. Or if you wanted to go from Hatti down to Egypt, you had to go through this land of Canaan that would eventually become known as Israel. And so you wouldn't want to go through the desert. That's the Arabian desert is out there in the middle, and that's not very hospitable. There's no water. You can get lost. You can die in the desert. And so invariably, most people would take the more comfortable land bridge to get from one center of civilization to the other, which makes the land of Canaan very strategically important. So here's this land that's eventually going to be called Israel, and we have Egypt in the south. As I said, Egypt was the center of great civilization. Got a picture there of one of the major pyramids. I like to refer to it as the not so great pyramid, although it's within just 20 feet or so as large as the Great Pyramid. The pyramids, I should mention, were already ancient monuments in the days of Abraham. They had already been there for hundreds upon hundreds of years. And so Egypt was a long-standing empire slash civilization slash nation that would have its ups and downs. In fact, by Abraham's day, Egypt had been there a long time, and Egypt had sort of fallen apart and come back together again. So they had been through what we now call, they didn't call it this, but we call it the Old Kingdom, and in Abraham's day now was the Middle Kingdom, and we call it that because there's going to be a new kingdom even after that. So you have Egypt there to the southwest of Israel. You have countries like Assyria. That's one of the countries that's going to be there in Mesopotamia with its capital at Nineveh. And they're going to play a very big role in the Old Testament story. We have the Hittites. I already made mention of them, the people of Hatti. They are there. I think they play an important part, but they're not mentioned much in the Bible. But I think it is helpful for us to see them as part of the bigger picture. You also have the city of Babylon. In fact, Genesis chapter 11 is going to refer to a city and a tower at Babel. Now, Babel and Babylon are going to be the same thing. So Babylon is going to be a significant city for the Bible. A very ancient city, although throughout a lot of its history, it wasn't the major sort of superpower. There will come a day when it does that. But Assyria usually was overshadowing Babylon. Some other countries we ought to mention. There is Aram. Now, you go there today and you rarely will hear somebody, at least in English, speak about the country of Aram. We use the more popular, more modern Roman designation. The Romans referred to this place as Syria. Not Assyria, but Syria. I'm not going to use the term Syria, or I'm going to try to refrain from that. I will speak of Assyria there and on the banks of the Tigris River, and I'll speak, instead of Syria, I'll speak of Aram. In fact, maybe you've heard that in New Testament times, one of the common languages in that part of the world was Aramaic. Well, you get Aramaic from the people of Aram with its capital at Damascus. Another people we ought to mention are the Phoenicians. Again, they're going to play a prominent part in our Old Testament story. The Phoenicians were the ocean-going people. They were the merchants. They lived right along the coast, modern-day Lebanon. And maybe you've heard the Bible refer to the cedars of Lebanon. These great trees that grow right along the coast there, the Phoenicians made good use of those and built ships that sailed all over the Mediterranean. And so these were the ocean-going people, even as the Israelites would be more oriented toward the land and toward deserts. So you're going to have two very different peoples, which mean they're not really competing for the same stuff, and they get along more often than not. They're getting along with each other. Now, we're going to focus on Canaan itself. So we're zooming in just on this land of Canaan, much smaller map, looking at this area in a great more detail. Notice there's not much variation along the coast. You've got that widely sloping coastline, but no natural harbors, no natural inlets, which is why the Israelites aren't going to really be a seagoing people. In fact, they will largely be confined to the land. Think about it. Every time in Old or New Testament you read about somebody getting into a boat who's Jewish, they get into trouble. The ocean was a dangerous place. They're even going to refer to that little body of water in the north, the Sea of Galilee. They're going to refer to that as a sea instead of, we would just call it a lake. Now, I want to look at a cross-section. So on the bottom of our map, we have a cross-section looking at the terrain. Notice as I begin coming up from the Mediterranean, I have this coastal plain, and as I said, it's sort of flat. There's not a lot of variation in the coast, not really given to natural harbors for the most part. And you can stand on the coast and you can look to the east and you're going to see the foothills, and a little bit past there, you're actually going to see the mountains. They are that close. So I move up to the central mountain range, and that central mountain range, now don't think high mountains like the Himalayas. In the south, for example, Jerusalem, you have the Mount of Olives. It's about 2,500 feet above sea level. Not incredibly high. Much lower than, for example, the Appalachian Mountains of the United States. But there is this central mountain range, and we're going to see it's broken by a valley about midway, but then it continues into Galilee. And when you get into Galilee, you actually have what you call Lower Galilee. You can go a little higher. Upper Galilee has some ranges that are maybe 3,000, maybe even 3,300, 3,500 feet above sea level. but not incredibly high. And then if you continue going east after the Central Mountain Range, you find yourself in what's known as the Jordan Rift Valley. And this entire valley is actually below sea level. In fact, on our map, see that gray area that follows that Jordan Rift Valley? Wherever it's gray, that's actually indicating that portion of the land is actually below sea level. So that if you were to cut a channel in, from the Mediterranean into the Jordan Rift Valley, all that part would now be underwater. And you begin with the Sea of Galilee, which is 600 feet below sea level, and the Jordan River goes downhill all the way down to the Dead Sea. When I first started teaching the Bible back in the 1970s, I used to say that the Dead Sea was 1,200 feet below sea level, and it was, give or take, but it has dropped. In my time, it has dropped by 200 feet, so now it's closer to 1,400 feet below sea level. Now this is an old picture, compliments of National Geographic from about 30, 40 years ago, and it shows the Jordan River as it's gradually winding its way southward. Notice you have this sort of well-watered valley, because back in those days, in fact until fairly recently, the Jordan was a seasonal river. And in the winter and springtime, this river would overflow its banks and flood that entire area. That could happen fairly often, and that was a good thing because it made that area nice and fertile. Of course, it made it a hazard of navigation. If you wanted to cross the Jordan, you waited until spring was over and summer was there, when the rainy season would end and things would dry out, and then it was nice and easy to cross over. Another picture, just working our way further southward, that straightens up a bit as we get close to the Dead Sea, and you can see still winding in the north at the top part of our picture, but finally it straightens out and it flows down to the Dead Sea, a full nowadays 1,400 feet below sea level, the lowest spot on the face of the earth. As I continue moving east, I get now to the Transjordanian Plateau, and this is even higher than was the Central Mountain Range of Canaan. And the area here is around 3,000 to 3,500 feet above sea level, and that if I continue going east from that, I'm eventually going to find myself in the Arabian Desert. Now, as I said, there's a valley that intersects that Central Mountain Range of Canaan, the Valley of Jezreel, a wide open valley. Here I'm standing on the mound of Megiddo. It was actually an ancient city that guarded the pass through that mountain range, and looking across this wide, fertile valley, most of the battles in the Bible about which I'm going to read take place on this valley. It's here that Deborah is going to fight. Deborah and the Israelites will fight the people of Hatzor. It's going to be here on this valley where Gideon fights the Midianites. It will be here on this valley, or at least a slope of it, where Saul fights the Philistines. Over and over and over again, we're going to see this valley very important. I can look across the valley today, and I can see a town on the other side. Actually, it's the town of Nazareth, the place where Jesus grew up. He grew up on the edge of this valley as well. So I have the Valley of Jezreel, and I also want to speak of some of the rivers. I have the Jordan River flowing from the Sea of Galilee all the way down to the Dead Sea. In fact, that's what the word Jordan means. It means the descent from Dan. Dan was the place as far north as you could be and still be in Israel. We'll see how that name comes to be. But I have some other rivers. First, the Yarmuk, not even mentioned in the Bible, any place where I've noticed. But this area on the east side of the Jordan River would become known as Gilead. Anytime I hear the word Gilead, and there will be places like Ramoth Gilead and Jabesh Gilead, and the term Gilead is always on the east side of the Jordan River. So as soon as I hear Gilead, I know I'm to the east of the Jordan River. So moving south from the Yarmuk, I come to the Jabbok River. Now, the Jabbok River, the word Jabbok means place of wrestling. And it's here where Jacob wrestled with the angel. That's probably how it got its name. Today there's a dam across it, so it probably wasn't that high. I'm looking at it upstream from the dam in the land of Jordan. But here I have the Jabbok River, and then working my way south of Gilead, I've got the Jabbok River, and then continuing south, where here's a river that flows not into the Jordan River, but into the Dead Sea, and that's the Arnon River. The Arnon River, if I can describe a canyon that reminds me a little bit, much smaller than the Grand Canyon, but still has that canyon-looking sort of thing, that's the Arnon. And that was the northern border of the land of Moab. So there's the Arnon, and there is Moab. And here's a picture of the Arnon River. You say, well, where's the river? It's the river that's carved out that canyon. And when it does rain, it will just cut deep crevices into the canyon areas there. Now, there's some major roads that came across the land of Canaan. First of all, there is the King's Highway. And, well, let me back up there. There's the King's Highway. Well, I guess there's no easy way to do this. And the King's Highway is the one on the right. It goes from Damascus just southward all the way down to Aqaba. And at a point south of Damascus, that actually divides into a second road, and this was called the Way of the Sea, also known as the Way of the Philistines. And it would cross the upper Jordan and then come across the Jezreel Valley and through one of those narrow passes in the mountain that juts all the way out to the Mediterranean. In fact, it was that city of Megiddo that would guard those passes, which was its strategic importance. And then it would go along the coast, which is why it was called the Way of the Sea, or the Way of the Philistines, all the way down to Egypt. There was another road that passed by. Sorry, that flickered on and off so quickly. But it was a seasonal road. And it went from east to west, leaving the King's Highway and going straight across, just north of the Dead Sea, over to the Way of the Sea. You couldn't cross this way in the wintertime or the springtime because the Jordan would be overflowing its banks. And guarding this road was a small city called Jericho. So we've talked about Megiddo, we've talked about Jericho, and we've looked at those. Let's talk a minute about the climate of Canaan. Canaan has what's known as a Mediterranean climate. By that we mean that it doesn't normally get way too hot. Now there can be exceptions to this, but it doesn't normally get way too hot or in the summertime or way too cold in the wintertime. As I said, there can be some notable exceptions. I've actually been in by the Sea of Galilee when it was 110 degrees, but that was setting a record high. That's not usually the case. So it's usually more of a moderate climate, and then the land is dependent upon the winter rains. You see, around October you have normally your early rains. Now it doesn't stop raining in December. Actually, it rains a little bit more in November and December. And January is usually the height of your rainy season. And then it begins to decrease so that February and March is a little bit less. And you get to April and you finally get the last of your latter rains. It may or may not rain in April. You get to May and it hardly rains at all, except maybe on the coast. But throughout most of the land, you're not going to see any rain in May, June, July, August, September, until the next October. So the climate has winter rains. We call them the early and the later rains, beginning in October, ending finally in April. And then throughout the summer, there's hardly any rain at all. The other thing we want to speak about is Eastern versus Western thinking. Now, I'm indebted to the book by Richards, and I forget the name of the other author, Misreading the Scriptures Through Western Eyes. They've done a wonderful job in delineating the difference between Western and Eastern thinking. Here in the West, we tend to value and speak a great deal about individualism. It's all about what I do, and I'm my own man. In Eastern thinking, it was very different. They were more collectivists in their thinking. It was all about family and the unit and the tribe. In Western thinking, we distinguish a lot. Our emphasis is upon right and wrong. In Eastern thinking, it was different. They still had those categories, right and wrong, but they were much more focused upon honor and shame. You bring honor on yourself or upon your family or upon your tribe, or correspondingly, bad actions could bring shame. And they're more oriented in those regards. In the West, we tend to be time-oriented. I'm always looking at my clock and keeping, because I have to be at class at a certain time, or I have certain things that I have to do. In Eastern thinking, they don't have quite that emphasis. First of all, they didn't have exact watches and timepieces, but they were much more oriented on the timeliness of an event. Is it happening in the right eon and era? There is a time for everything, and don't mix those sorts of things. In the West, we're all about rules. So we have stop signs, and we have these kinds of signs and that signs, and just follow the rules. In the East, it's more about, they still have rules, but it's more about relationship. And sometimes we lose track of relationship. It comes naturally to the Eastern mind. Now, we finally want to close on asking, what is the big idea of the Old Testament? And certainly lots of big ideas could be mentioned, looking for a promised Messiah and salvation and Israel. But I'm asking about the big idea over which there is nothing bigger. And let me suggest this one. The big idea of the Old Testament is that Yahweh is Lord. And every other aspect, whether it's about the Messiah or Israel or God or grace, all come under that one heading, Yahweh is Lord. But I also want to ask the corresponding question, what is the big idea of the New Testament? If the big idea of the Old Testament is that Yahweh is Lord, let me suggest that the big idea of the New Testament, because it's repeated 5 or 6 times, Jesus is Lord. And when I say that, just put those two ideas together. And I think it communicates a great deal.